The memory came to Mary Callahan, like a desert mirage shimmering and precious in the scorching heat of Dustvale Gorge. Just 6 months ago, she had been kneeling in their little garden behind the cabin, her hands dirty with rich soil, watching 5-year-old Rosie chase butterflies between the tomato plants. Patrick had been there too, his weathered hands gentle as he helped little Samuel plant seeds, his Irish laughter mixing with the children's giggles like music in the warm afternoon air. "Mama, look." Rosie had cried, cupping a monarch butterfly in her tiny palms. "It's got wings like sunshine." Patrick had smiled, his green eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just like you, little Rose. Beautiful and bright enough to light up the whole world." But now, as the howling wind of Dustvale Gorge ripped through the red sandstone cliffs with the voice of a banshee, that memory felt like something from another life. Above the auction block, turkey buzzards circled in the copper sky, their black wings casting ominous shadows over the jeering crowd. The air tasted of dust and desperation, thick with the promise of violence that seemed to seep from the very stones of this godforsaken place. Mary's hands trembled as rough fingers shoved her forward, the iron shackles cutting into her wrists. Behind her, 17-year-old Caleb struggled against his own bonds, his young face twisted with rage and helplessness. Emma, 15 and trying so hard to be brave, clutched 12-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Samuel to her sides, her blue eyes wide with terror she fought to hide. And there, on the weathered wooden platform that had seen too much suffering, stood her baby. Rosie's golden curls were matted with tears and dirt, her small wrists bound with rope that looked obscenely thick against her delicate bones. The child's terrified sobs cut through Mary's soul like a rusty blade. Above them all, a noose swayed in the desert wind, like a pendulum counting down to damnation. If only I'd seen the signs. Mary thought, the guilt crushing her chest like a boulder. If only I'd noticed Patrick coming home late those nights, the way his hands shook when he counted our money, the fear in his eyes when riders approached our land. She'd been so focused on birthing babies and tending the sick that she'd missed the growing shadow of her husband's desperation, the devil's bargain he'd made that would ultimately cost him his life and damn them all. A drunken voice rose from the crowd. "What's the bid for the little one? She'd make a fine servant." Mary's heart shattered as Rosie's terrified wail pierced the air. The Arizona Territory in 1887 was a land that God seemed to have forgotten, where red mesas jutted from the earth like ancient monuments to human suffering. Dustvale Gorge carved its way through the landscape, like a wound that would never heal, its walls stained crimson with iron ore and darker things. Here, where the Sonoran Desert met the mountains, civilization was a thin veneer over a foundation of violence and greed. Mary Callahan had come to this harsh place with Patrick 7 years ago, drawn by promises of silver in the mountains and the chance to build something lasting for their growing family. She'd established herself as the only midwife for 50 miles, her gentle hands and knowledge of healing herbs making her invaluable to the scattered settlers and even some of the Navajo families who lived in the hidden canyons. But in the 3 months since Patrick's death, thrown from his horse while riding home drunk from Agnes Poole's saloon or so, they told her everything had begun to crumble like the sandstone cliffs after a flash flood. The knock on her cabin door came just after sunset, when the desert was painted in shades of blood and gold. Mary wiped her hands on her apron, having just finished treating a rancher's broken arm, and opened the door to find Sheriff Daniels standing on her porch with a paper in his hands and shame in his eyes. "Evening, Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've got some legal business to discuss." Behind him stood 2 men she recognized: Silas Grimm, Virgil Kane's right-hand man, a scarred brute who looked like he'd crawled out of a shallow grave, and Eli Crow, barely 18, but already wearing a gun, like he knew how to use it. There was something about young Eli that had always made Mary uneasy, the way his pale blue eyes never quite met hers, the nervous way he fingered his hat brim when he spoke. "Sheriff," Mary said carefully. "Come in. Children, go to your rooms." Caleb lingered in the doorway, his hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife on his belt. At 17, He was nearly as tall as his father had been, with Patrick's stubborn jaw and Mary's fierce green eyes. "Ma, maybe I should stay." "It's all right, son." But Mary's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. Sheriff Daniels unfolded the document with the careful movements of a man handling dynamite. "Mrs. Callahan, this here's a writ of debt collection. Seems your husband owed a considerable sum to Mr. Virgil Kane before his passing." Mary's world tilted. Debt? What debt Patrick never mentioned. $2,000. Silas Grimm interrupted, his voice like gravel in a tin cup. "Plus interest makes it near $3,000 now." The number hit Mary like a physical blow. $3,000 was more money than most people in the territory saw in a lifetime. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Patrick would have told me." Eli Crow spoke up, his voice deceptively mild. "Ma'am, I was there when your husband signed the papers. Mr. Kane was real generous with the terms, seeing as how Patrick was convinced that silver mine of his was gonna pay off big." Mary's blood turned to ice water. "What silver mine?" "The one up in Devil's Fork Canyon," Sheriff Daniels said quietly. "Patrick filed a claim 6 months ago. Put up your land and, well, your family as collateral." The cabin seemed to spin around Mary. Patrick had staked their children's lives on a mining claim he'd never even told her about. According to territorial law. Grimm continued with obvious satisfaction. "When a debtor dies without assets to cover his obligations, his family enters indentured servitude until the debt is satisfied." "You mean slavery?" Caleb snarled, having ignored his mother's order to leave. Grimm's scarred face split into a cold smile. "I mean legal indentured servitude, boy. Perfectly lawful in the Arizona territory for debts of this magnitude." Mary's mind raced. $3,000. At the wages an indentured servant might earn, it would take decades to pay off such a sum. Her children would grow up in bondage, never knowing freedom. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "I'm a midwife. I can work and pay it off over time." Sheriff Daniels looked genuinely pained. "Mary, I'm sorry. The law's the law. Mr. Kane's been patient, but he's got rights. The auction's set for 3 weeks from today." Auction. The word came out as a croak. "Public auction for indentured servitude contracts." Eli said, still in that mild tone that made Mary's skin crawl. "Whoever bids highest gets to own your family's labor until the debt's paid." As the men filed out into the desert night, Mary sank into Patrick's old chair and buried her face in her hands. Outside, she could hear a coyote howling in the distance, a sound like a soul in torment. That night, she held her children close and tried to explain the unexplainable, watching hope die in their eyes, like candle flames snuffed by a cruel wind. The morning of the auction dawned blood red over Dust Veil Gorge, with a wind that carried the promise of a sandstorm from the eastern desert. Mary had spent the night awake, holding baby Rosie and trying to memorize the feel of her daughter's small heartbeat against her chest. The auction block had been erected in the center of town, a hastily built platform of rough pine boards that still wept sap in the morning heat. By the time the sheriff's men came to collect the Callahan family, a crowd had already gathered, prospectors looking for cheap labor, ranch owners needing workers, and others drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. Mary's hands were bound behind her back, but she kept her head high as they marched her family through the dusty street. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break, not when her children needed her strength. Standing near the auction block was Virgil Kane himself, a man whose reputation cast a longer shadow than his physical presence might suggest. He was of medium height and build, with silver hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it all wanting. His expensive clothes and polished boots marked him as a man of wealth and power, the kind of man who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited. Beside him stood Agnes Poole, owner of the Dusty Rose Saloon, and the closest thing Dustvale had to high society. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with auburn hair piled high and a dress that cost more than most families' monthly income. But her green eyes held a coldness that made Mary shiver despite the desert heat. "Well, well," Agnes said as Mary was led past. "Mary Callahan. I always wondered what happened to girls who thought they were too good for honest work." Mary bit back her reply. Agnes had made her feelings clear months ago when she'd suggested that Mary might earn better money working in the saloon than delivering babies. The implication had been unmistakable, and Mary's refusal had earned her Agnes's lasting enmity. The auctioneer, a thin man with the pale skin of someone who spent his life indoors, climbed onto the platform and called for attention. His voice carried clearly across the gathering crowd, a mixture of rough miners, suspicious ranchers, and curious townspeople. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to conduct a legal auction for indentured servitude contracts, as authorized by the Territory of Arizona. The Callahan family, consisting of one adult female and 4 minor children, will be sold as a group to satisfy a debt of $3,000 owed to Mr. Virgil Kane." A murmur ran through the crowd. $3,000 was a fortune in this part of the world. "Now," the auctioneer continued, "the successful bidder will hold the labor contracts for all 5 family members until such time as their combined earnings satisfy the debt plus reasonable living expenses." Mary felt Caleb tense beside her. At 17, her eldest son had his father's temper and his mother's fierce protectiveness. She could see the muscles in his shoulders bunching, and she prayed he wouldn't do anything foolish. "We'll start the bidding at $500. A rancher Mary didn't recognize raised his hand. "500. I hear 500. Do I hear 6? The bidding climbed slowly at first, then more rapidly as the crowd realized what they were witnessing. Mary tried to block out the voices treating her family like livestock, but individual words pierced through her mental defenses like arrows. "Strong boys for ranch work. Woman's got healing skills. Little one would make a good house servant." When the bidding reached $2,000 held by a cattle baron from Tucson, who looked at her children like they were prize bulls, Mary closed her eyes and prayed to a God who seemed to have abandoned this corner of his creation. Then a new voice cut through the morning air like a knife through canvas. $3,000. The crowd fell silent. Mary's eyes snapped open to see a man she'd never noticed before stepping forward from the edge of the gathering. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes marked him as a working man, worn leather chaps, a faded shirt, and boots that had seen hard use. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet authority. $3,000, the auctioneer sputtered. "That covers the entire debt, sir. Are you certain?" "I'm certain," the stranger said quietly. Virgil Kane stepped forward, his pale eyes glittering with sudden interest. "That's a generous bid, friend. Might I ask your name?" "By Jonah Vale," the man replied, without taking his eyes off the auction block. Mary saw something flicker across Kane's face, recognition, surprise, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Well, Mr. Vale." Agnes Poole interjected, her voice honey-sweet with an undertone of venom. "That's quite an investment in some very questionable merchandise. The woman's got a reputation for thinking herself above her station, and that boy of hers has a look of trouble about him." Jonah Vale's gray eyes shifted to Agnes, and Mary saw something cold and dangerous in their depths. "I reckon I can judge the worth of what I'm buying, ma'am." The auctioneer called for any higher bids, but the crowd remained silent. $3,000 was more than most of them would see in 5 years. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. "The Callahan family indentured contracts go to Mr. Jonah Vale for $3,000. As the bonds were cut from Mary's wrists, she found herself face to face with the man who now owned her family's lives. His eyes were kind, she realized with surprise, but they held depths of pain that spoke of hard-won wisdom and old wounds that had never properly healed. "Mr. Vale," she said quietly, "I want you to know that we're not afraid of honest work. My children are good children, and I'll make sure they earn their keep." Jonah Vale was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as if trying to read something written there in a language he was still learning. "Mrs. Callahan," he said finally, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. "I've got a cabin about 5 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's got good water and room enough for a family. As for the indenture contracts..." He reached into his coat and pulled out the legal documents, then did something that shocked Mary to her core. He tore them in half. No person should own another person's life. He said, simply letting the pieces fall to the dusty ground. "You and your children are free to go where you please when you please." Mary stared at him in amazement. Behind her, she heard Caleb's sharp intake of breath and little Rosie's confused whimper. "I don't understand," Mary whispered. "You just spent $3,000. "I spent $3,000 buying back something that never should have been for sale in the first place," Jonah replied. "If you've got nowhere else to go, you're welcome to stay at my place until you figure out your next step. But you stay as guests, not servants." As they walked away from the auction block, Mary caught sight of Virgil Kane's face. The railroad tycoon was watching Jonah Vale with an expression she couldn't quite read, speculation, mixed with something that might have been old anger. Agnes Poole's reaction was easier to interpret. The saloon owner's green eyes blazed with fury as she watched her entertainment slip away. "This isn't over," Agnes called after them, her honey-sweet voice turned bitter as wormwood. "Mark my words, Mary Callahan. This isn't over." Jonah Vale's cabin sat in a narrow valley where cottonwoods grew thick along a year-round stream. After the harsh desolation of Dust Vale Gorge, the sight of green leaves and flowing water seemed like a miracle to Mary's parched soul. The cabin itself was modest, but well built, with a stone chimney and glass windows that spoke of a man who valued comfort over mere survival. But it was clearly the home of a man living alone. The single room was neat, but sparse, with only one bed, one chair, and cooking gear for one person. More telling were the small signs of isolation, the way Jonah hesitated before lighting the lamp, as if he'd forgotten anyone else might need the light, and the careful way he rationed his words, as if speech itself had become a precious commodity. "You can have the bed," Jonah said quietly to Mary, gesturing toward the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll set up bedrolls for the young ones, and I'll sleep outside." "Mr. Vale," Mary began, but he held up a weathered hand. "Just Jonah, ma'am. And before you start feeling beholden, let me tell you something." He paused, his gray eyes focusing on something beyond the cabin walls. "My wife, Sarah, before she died, made me promise something. She said if I ever had the chance to help folks who couldn't help themselves, I should take it. Said the good Lord judges a man not by what he keeps, but by what he gives away." Caleb, who had been silent during the walk from town, finally spoke up. "Why should we trust you? For all we know, this is just another kind of trap." Mary started to scold her son, but Jonah raised a hand. "Boy's got a right to be suspicious. Hell, I'd think less of him if he weren't." He fixed Caleb with a steady look. "You want to test my intentions? There's the door. Take your family and walk out. I won't stop you." The challenge hung in the air between them. Mary held her breath, watching her son's face work through emotions too complex for his 17 years. Finally, Caleb's shoulders slumped slightly. "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. "We got nothing. No money, no supplies, no place to run to. Mama tell me where we'd go." Mary felt the weight of her children's need pressing down on her like a physical thing. 5-year-old Rosie had fallen asleep in Emma's arms, exhausted by the terror of the morning. Thomas and Samuel huddled close together, their young faces showing the hollow look of children who had seen too much of the world's cruelty too soon. "We stay," she said quietly. "For now we stay. That first night was the longest Mary could remember since Patrick's death. She lay in Jonah's narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person's home. The children slept fitfully on their makeshift bedrolls, with Emma keeping protective watch over the little ones, and Caleb positioned near the door like a sentry. Through the single window, Mary could see Jonah's shadow moving around a small campfire he'd built near the stream. She wondered what thoughts kept him wakeful, what ghosts haunted his solitude. The answer came in the form of a woman's name, whispered to the desert wind in a voice raw with old grief: Sarah. Mary woke to the sound of retching outside the cabin. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see little Rosie doubled over near the well, vomiting what looked like black bile onto the sandy ground. Rosie. Mary rushed to her daughter's side, pressing a cool hand to the child's fevered forehead. The little girl's skin was burning hot, and her eyes held a glassy, unfocused look that made Mary's blood run cold. Jonah appeared beside them, still pulling on his shirt. What happened? She's burning up. Mary said, her midwife training taking over. Help me get her inside. As they carried Rosie into the cabin, Mary's mind raced through possibilities. Food poisoning, some desert fever. But the black bile worried her most. She'd seen similar symptoms only once before, in a case of mercury poisoning from a contaminated well. Jonah, she said urgently, where does your water come from? The well out back. Been good water for 3 years. But something in his voice suggested doubt was creeping in. While Mary tended to Rosie with cool cloths and gentle herbs, Jonah went to examine the well. What he found made his jaw clench with cold fury. Someone had dumped a bucket of mercury-tainted ore into the water source, turning it into a slow-acting poison. Caleb, he called quietly to the young man. Come here, but don't alarm your mother. When Caleb saw the evidence, his face went white with rage. They poisoned us. Cain's men poisoned us. Likely, Jonah agreed grimly. Question is, what do we do about it? Caleb's hand went to his knife. I say we ride into town and settle this like men, and leave your sick sister and the rest of your family unprotected. Jonah's voice was patient but firm. Think, boy. This is exactly what they want to draw us away from home, make us act stupid with anger. The lesson in strategy was interrupted by Emma's cry from inside the cabin. Mama Rosie's getting worse. Mary worked through the day with desperate skill, using every herb and remedy she knew to purge the poison from her daughter's small body. Jonah rode hard to the nearest settlement, with good water returning with enough clean supply to last them a week. But as the sun set over the red cliffs, Rosie's condition remained critical. I'm not enough, Mary whispered to Jonah as they kept vigil by her daughter's bedside. I'm just a midwife. She needs a real doctor. Nearest doctor's in Tucson. Jonah replied quietly. 3 days hard riding. Then we go to Tucson. Mary. His voice was gentle but firm. The child can't travel. Moving her now would kill her for sure. The truth of it hit Mary like a physical blow. Her daughter was dying, and there was nothing she could do but watch and pray to a God who seemed determined to test her beyond endurance. That night, as Rosie's fever broke and the crisis passed, Mary found herself sitting by the stream with Jonah, both of them too exhausted for sleep. Now why? She asked quietly. Why would someone poison a child? Jonah was quiet for a long time, staring into the moving water as if it might hold answers. Because some folks see other people as obstacles instead of human beings. Because power without conscience is the most dangerous thing in the world. You know who did this? It wasn't a question. Mary had seen the recognition in Jonah's eyes when Virgil Cain spoke his name at the auction. I know, Jonah said simply. Tell me. Another long silence. Then, Virgil Cain and I have history. Bad history. I worked for him once years ago, and I learned what kind of man he really is. When I tried to leave his employ, he made it clear that wasn't acceptable. What kind of work? the kind that leaves marks on a man's soul. Jonah's voice was barely above a whisper. The kind I swore I'd never do again. Mary studied his profile in the starlight, seeing the deep lines that spoke of hard choices and harder consequences. And now he knows you're here. Now he knows I'm here. The implication hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. By saving her family, Jonah had marked himself as a target. Cain would come for him, and anyone who stood with him would be caught in the crossfire. We should leave, Mary said quietly. Take the children and go somewhere else. Where? Jonah asked the same question Caleb had posed days earlier. How far do you think you'd get with a sick child and no money? And what makes you think Cain would just let you walk away? You've seen too much, know too much. In his mind, you're already dead. The brutal honesty of it made Mary shiver despite the warm night air. She thought of her children sleeping in the cabin, finally safe and peaceful for the first time in weeks, and realized that safety was an illusion she could no longer afford to believe in. Then we make our stand here, she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Jonah looked at her with something that might have been respect. You sure about that? It's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm sure. As if summoned by her words, the night erupted in flames. Orange light bloomed against the dark sky as Jonah's barn caught fire, the dry wood crackling like gunshots in the desert silence. Get the children, Jonah shouted, already running toward the burning structure. Get them out of the cabin. Mary ran for her family as the night filled with smoke and the distant sound of galloping horses. The message was clear. Next time it wouldn't be just the barn. Next time they'd burn it all. The attack on the barn was just the beginning. Over the following days, a campaign of terror unfolded with the methodical precision of a military operation. Jonah's remaining livestock was poisoned. His garden was trampled in the night. Shots were fired at the cabin windows after dark, keeping everyone awake and on edge. But the psychological warfare was worse than the physical attacks. When Mary rode into town for medical supplies to treat a rancher's injured son, she found doors that had always been open to her suddenly closed. Agnes Poole had been spreading whispers like plague throughout Dust Vale, painting Mary as a woman who brought death and misfortune wherever she went. It's no coincidence, Agnes told anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with false concern. First, her husband dies under mysterious circumstances. Then that family falls into debt, and now everywhere she goes, there's sickness and fire. Some women are just cursed, and the curse spreads to anyone fool enough to help them. The superstition took root in the desert soil of ignorance and fear. Pregnant women who had previously sought Mary's help now crossed themselves and turned away when they saw her coming. Storekeepers who had been happy to extend credit suddenly demanded cash payment for even the most basic supplies. Most painful of all was the reaction of Elena Vasquez, a young Navajo woman whose difficult birth Mary had managed just 2 months earlier. When Mary encountered Elena at the trading post, the woman clutched her healthy baby closer and whispered words in her native language that needed no translation. Elena, Mary said gently, it's me. Mary, I helped deliver your son. Elena's dark eyes were full of fear and something that might have been pity. I am sorry, Mrs. Callahan, she said in careful English. But my grandmother says some women carry death with them like a sickness. She says I must protect my child. The rejection cut deeper than any physical wound. Mary had spent years building relationships in this community, earning trust one successful delivery at a time. Now all of that was crumbling under the weight of Agnes Poole's poisoned tongue. Meanwhile, Caleb's anger was reaching a dangerous boiling point. The 17-year-old paced the cabin like a caged animal, his hand never far from his knife. This is coward's work, he snarled during dinner on the third night. Burning barns and poisoning wells instead of facing us like men. Pa never would have stood for this. Your pa isn't here, Mary replied sharply. And if he were, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but the stress of their situation was wearing on everyone's nerves. Caleb's face flushed red with anger and hurt. So it's Pa's fault we're here. Not Kane's, not the men trying to kill us, but Pa's. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You blame him for dying, for leaving us, for making that deal with Kane. Well, maybe if you'd paid more attention to your husband, instead of every sick stranger who came knocking, you'd have known what trouble he was in. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a burned-out building. Mary felt the truth of it cut into her heart. She had been so focused on her calling as a healer that she'd missed the signs of her husband's desperation. Jonah, who had been quietly cleaning his rifle in the corner, spoke without looking up. Boy, you want to spend your energy blaming someone for this mess? I suggest you aim it at the folks actually trying to hurt your family. And who would that be exactly? Caleb shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like everyone in this godforsaken town wants us dead or gone. Not everyone, Emma said quietly from where she sat mending Thomas's torn shirt. At 15, Mary's eldest daughter had always been the peacemaker in the family, blessed with a wisdom beyond her years. Mrs. Henderson from the trading post slipped me extra flour when I bought supplies yesterday. She didn't say anything, just put it in the bag and wouldn't take payment for it. Jonah nodded approvingly. There's good people in every place, even the dark ones. Sometimes they just need time to find their courage. But courage seemed to be in short supply in Dustvale. That night, as the family settled down to sleep, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent everyone scrambling for cover. 6 riders circled the cabin in the darkness, their faces hidden by bandanas, their intentions clear from the torches they carried. Come out, Callahan, one of them shouted. Time to settle accounts. Jonah crouched by the window with his rifle, his face grim in the lamplight. That's Silas Grimm's voice, Kane's top gun. Mary gathered her younger children in the corner, farthest from the windows, while Caleb positioned himself by the door with his hunting knife. The situation felt hopeless, 6 armed men against a family with 1 rifle and a teenager's blade. Then Jonah did something unexpected. He set his rifle aside and opened the cabin door. Grimm, he called out, stepping into the doorway where the riders could see him clearly. You and I both know this isn't about the Callahans. This is about you and me. Silas Grimm spurred his horse closer, the torch in his hand, casting dancing shadows across his scarred face. Well, well, Jonah Vale. Should have known you'd turn up in the middle of someone else's trouble. Leave the family out of this, Jonah said steadily. You want to settle old business, we settle it between men. Grimm's laugh was like the sound of rocks falling down a cliff. Oh, we'll settle it all right. But see, the thing is, Mr. Kane has developed a special interest in Mrs. Callahan and her brood. Seems there's more to her late husband's affairs than a simple mining debt. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. What did Kane know about Patrick that she didn't? You've got 1 week. Grimm continued his voice, carrying easily across the stillness. 1 week to disappear, or we come back and burn everything that stands. And next time, we won't be so particular about who's inside when the fires start. The riders wheeled their horses and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the promise of violence to come. As the family huddled together in the cabin, Mary realized that their time was running out. Whatever game Kane was playing, whatever secrets Patrick had carried to his grave, the end game was approaching fast, and she still had no idea what she was really fighting for. The betrayal came from the last place Mary expected it at young Eli Crow, the nervous 18-year-old who had been helping them gather information about Kane's operations in town. Emma had befriended the boy during their trips to Dustvale, seeing in him a kindred spirit who seemed as uncomfortable with the town's growing atmosphere of violence as she was. He's different from the others, Emma had told her mother after Eli helped her carry supplies to their wagon. He asks about our family, wants to know if we're safe. I think he feels bad about what's happening to us." Mary had been grateful for any show of kindness from the townspeople, but Jonah had seemed more cautious about the young man's interest. "Boy asks a lot of questions for someone just being friendly," he'd observed after Eli's third visit to their cabin. "Wants to know an awful lot about our plans, our routines." But Mary had dismissed Jonah's concerns as the paranoia of a man who'd learned to trust no one. It wasn't until the night Eli arrived at their cabin, pale and shaking, claiming to have urgent information about Cain's next move, that the truth became clear. "Mrs. Callahan," Eli said, his voice trembling with what Mary took for fear, "you've got to listen to me. I overheard Cain talking to Agnes at the saloon. They're planning something big for tomorrow night, a raid on every homestead between here and the mountains. They're calling it a bandit sweep. But it's really about driving out anyone who might stand against them." Mary's blood ran cold. "Are you certain?" "I heard every word," Eli insisted. "Cain's bringing in men from Tucson, maybe 30 or 40 gunfighters. They're going to hit the Martinez place, the Henderson Ranch, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "And here. They're saving this place for last." Jonah had been silent during this exchange, but Mary noticed his hand resting on his rifle. "That's very specific information, son. Cain trusts you with details like that." Eli's pale blue eyes darted nervously between them. "I work at the livery stable. People talk around me like I'm not there. Sometimes I hear things I'm not supposed to." It was Emma who noticed the inconsistency first. "Eli," she said slowly, "you told me yesterday that you'd been working at Agnes's saloon all week. When did you start working at the livery?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Eli's face went white, then red, then white again, as he struggled to find an answer that would make sense. Both places," he stammered. "I work both places." Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his knife in his hand. "You lying piece of—" "Caleb, no." Mary grabbed her son's arm, but her heart was breaking as she watched the truth dawn in Emma's eyes. Her daughter had trusted this boy, maybe even cared for him, and he had betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible. Jonah stood slowly, his rifle now cradled in his arms. "Eli," he said quietly, "I think you better tell us exactly why you're here." The young man's composure cracked completely. Tears started flowing down his cheeks as he pulled a small pistol from inside his jacket, not to threaten them, but to place it on the table between them, like an offering. "Cain's got my sister," he whispered. "Grabbed her 3 days ago, said he'd kill her if I didn't find out your plans. I never wanted to hurt anybody, Mrs. Callahan. I swear I never wanted this." The confession hit Mary like a physical blow. Here was another family torn apart by Virgil Cain's schemes, another innocent caught in the web of greed and power that seemed to corrupt everything it touched. "Where is she?" Mary asked gently. "That Devil's Fork," Eli said through his tears. "The old mining camp up in the canyon. Cain's using it as a base for his operations." Mary exchanged glances with Jonah. Devil's Fork was an abandoned silver mine about 10 miles north of Dustvale, a place where the mountains closed in like the walls of a trap. It would be the perfect location for someone who wanted to control access to the surrounding territory. "What else?" Jonah asked, his voice still gentle but implacable. "What else did you tell him?" Eli's shoulders shook with the force of his sobs. "Everything. Your routines when you go to town, how many guns you have where the children sleep. Oh God, Mrs. Callahan, I'm so sorry. They made me draw them a map of your cabin." The implications were staggering. Cain knew everything about their defenses, their vulnerabilities, their habits. Any plan they might make would be anticipated, any escape route blocked before they could reach it. Emma spoke into the silence, her voice carefully controlled. "Eli, when is the raid really happening?" The young man looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Tonight, as soon as the moon sets. I was supposed to keep you talking until they got into position." Mary felt the world tilt around her. Outside, the moon was already low on the horizon. They had maybe 2 hours before the Kane's men surrounded the cabin. "We have to run," Caleb said immediately. "Take the horses and head for Mexico." "No horses," Jonah said grimly. "If Eli's been reporting to them, they'll know exactly where we keep our mounts. Probably already cut them loose, or worse." Mary looked around the cabin at her children, Emma trying to be strong while her heart broke. Caleb vibrating with helpless rage, the little ones still asleep and unaware that their world was about to explode again. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush her completely. Then her eyes fell on Patrick's old traveling bag, stuffed in the corner where she'd left it after their hasty departure from their original home. Something about its placement nagged at her, and she realized she'd never actually gone through all of her husband's possessions. "Jonah," she said quietly, "I need you to buy me some time, whatever it takes." "Mary, please, just give me 5 minutes with Patrick's things. There might be something—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't explain the sudden certainty that her husband had left her something important, something that might change the balance of power in this deadly game. Jonah nodded grimly. 5 minutes. Then we move with or without whatever you're looking for." As Mary tore through Patrick's belongings with desperate efficiency, she could hear Jonah questioning Eli about the exact number of men, their weapons, their planned approach. The young man answered with the thoroughness of someone trying to atone for his betrayal. But Mary could tell from Jonah's voice that the odds were impossible. Then her fingers found it, a leather portfolio sewn into the lining of Patrick's coat, hidden so carefully that she would never have found it if desperation hadn't made her search so thoroughly. Inside were documents that made her heart stop. Land deeds, mining claims, and a contract signed by Virgil Kane himself acknowledging Patrick's ownership of not just the silver claim at Devil's Fork, but 3 other mines in the surrounding mountains. According to the papers in her hands, Patrick hadn't been Kane's debtor, he'd been his partner. And according to the production reports included in the portfolio, those mines had been producing high-grade silver ore for over a year, which meant that Virgil Kane owed the Callahan family a fortune. "Mary." Jonah called urgently. "Time's up, we need to—" The sound of gunfire erupted outside the cabin as the first wave of Kane's men opened fire. The raid had begun early. The first bullets splintered the cabin's wooden walls like kindling, sending deadly splinters flying through the air. Mary threw herself over the little ones as Jonah and Caleb took positions at the windows, returning fire with grim determination. "How many?" Mary shouted over the din. "Too many." Jonah called back, his rifle cracking steadily. "At least 20, maybe more." Through the broken window, Mary could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. Kane's men had surrounded the cabin, completely cutting off any hope of escape. But there was something else out there, shadows moving differently from the attacking gunmen. "Mama," Emma cried, clutching Samuel and Thomas to her chest. "The roof." Smoke was beginning to seep through the ceiling. Someone had climbed onto the cabin and set fire to the wooden shingles. "We're trapped," Caleb said grimly, reloading his rifle with steady hands despite the chaos around them. Mary made a decision that surprised even herself. Clutching Patrick's papers, she stood up in full view of the windows. "Kane!" she shouted at the top of her lungs. "Virgil Kane, I know you're out there. I've got something you want." The gunfire slackened slightly enough for her voice to carry across the clearing. "I've got Patrick's papers," she continued. "The real ones. The ones that show you owe us money, not the other way around." A new voice cut through the night, Kane himself speaking from somewhere near the tree line. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm impressed by your resourcefulness, but I'm afraid those papers won't do you much good if you're dead." "Maybe not," Mary called back, "but I've got copies hidden where you'll never find them. You kill us and those papers go to the territorial authorities. You want them, you come and take them like a man." It was a bluff, but it bought them precious time. The roof fire was spreading quickly, but the gunfire had stopped completely as Kane considered his options. That's when the real surprise came. A new sound filled the night, the whooping war cry of Navajo warriors, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats as a dozen riders swept down from the hills. Leading them was a man Mary recognized from her visits to the trading post Iron Cloud, a Navajo warrior whose reputation for fierce independence was matched only by his legendary skill with a rifle. The riders struck Kane's men like lightning, their attacks so sudden and fierce that the would-be raiders found themselves caught between the cabin and a force of avenging spirits from the desert itself. Iron Cloud, Jonah shouted in amazement. What in hell? The Navajo warrior wheeled his horse near the cabin, his dark eyes reflecting the flames from the burning roof. The woman helped birth my nephew when no other healer would come. He called back in perfect English. Iron Cloud does not forget debts of honor. The battle turned savage quickly. Kane's men, caught off guard and outnumbered by an enemy that knew the terrain better than they knew their own names, began to break and run. But Kane himself was nowhere to be seen. He's not here, Eli Crow said suddenly from where he'd been huddled in the corner. Kane never comes to the actual fighting. He'll be back at Devil's Fork with my sister, waiting to see how it turns out. Mary realized with crystal clarity what had to happen next. We go to Devil's Fork tonight. Mary, no, Jonah said immediately. It's a trap. Kane will be ready for us. Let him be ready. Mary replied, her voice steady as bedrock. I'm done running. I'm done hiding. If Kane wants a war, he's got one. As the last of the gunfire died away and Iron Cloud's warriors rounded up the surviving raiders, Mary looked around at her family. Emma was comforting the little ones with quiet strength. Caleb was checking his weapons with the grim determination of a man twice his age. Even Eli Crow had picked up a rifle ready to fight for his sister's freedom. They were no longer refugees begging for mercy. They were a family going to war. Devil's Fork had earned its name honestly. The abandoned mining camp sat at the convergence of three narrow canyons, their red sandstone walls rising like prison bars toward a slice of star-filled sky. The old mine workings honeycombed the surrounding cliffs, creating a maze of tunnels and chambers that could hide an army or swallow unwary travelers forever. Mary rode beside Jonah and Iron Cloud at the head of their makeshift war party, Patrick's papers secured in her saddlebags, like ammunition for a different kind of weapon. Behind them came Caleb and Emma, both armed and determined, while the younger children had been left in the care of Iron Cloud's trusted relatives at a hidden camp in the foothills. Eli Crow had insisted on coming despite his betrayal, driven by guilt and love for his captive sister. I know the layout, he'd argued. Kane's been using the main mine office as his headquarters, and there's only 3 ways in or out. As they approached the entrance to Devil's Fork, the silence was oppressive. No guards, no sentries, no signs of life, except for the faint glow of lamplight from the mine office windows. It's too quiet. Jonah muttered, his rifle ready across his saddle. Kane's not stupid enough to leave this place undefended. Iron Cloud dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground, reading the earth like a book written in the language of horses and men. Many riders, he said quietly. Recent. They are here, but hidden. As if summoned by his words, a voice echoed from the canyon walls, Kane himself speaking through some kind of speaking trumpet that amplified his words until they seemed to come from the very stones. And welcome to Devil's Fork, Mrs. Callahan. I must say I'm impressed by your persistence. And Mr. Vale, it's been far too long since our last conversation. Mary felt Jonah tense beside her. There was something in Kane's tone, a familiarity that spoke of old business between the two men, business that had been settled with blood and betrayal. You want your papers, Mrs. Callahan, and I assume young Eli wants his sister very well. Come to the mine office alone and unarmed. Let's discuss this like civilized people. It's a trap, Caleb said immediately. Of course it's a trap, Mary replied. But it's also our only chance to end this. Jonah was studying the canyon walls with the eye of a man who understood military tactics. "He's got men positioned up there," he said, pointing to shadowy ledges that overlooked the entire canyon floor. "Crossfire positions. Anyone who enters that canyon is dead the moment Cain gives the word." Ironcloud spoke quietly to two of his warriors in Navajo and then turned back to the group. "My men know these canyons like the lines on their hands. They can reach those positions unseen." How long?" Mary asked. 1 hour, maybe less." Mary looked at the mine office, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Somewhere in that building, Cain was waiting with Eli's sister and whatever forces he'd assembled for this final confrontation. The smart thing would be to wait let Ironcloud's warriors neutralize the hidden gunmen before making their move. But Mary had run out of patience for smart moves. "I'm going in," she announced, dismounting from her horse. Mary, no, Jonah started. "He's right, though," she interrupted. "This needs to be settled between Cain and me. Patrick's papers give me the legal right to everything Cain's built here. That makes this as much about business as revenge." She pulled the leather portfolio from her saddlebags, checking to make sure the documents were secure. "Give Ironcloud's men 30 minutes to get into position. If I'm not out by then, come in shooting." Jonah grabbed her arm as she started toward the canyon entrance. "Mary, Cain will kill you the moment you walk through that door." She looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw something that made her heart skip. Not just concern for her safety, but something deeper and more personal. In all the chaos and terror of the past weeks, something had grown between them, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual respect. "Maybe," she said softly. "But if I don't try, we'll all be dead by morning anyway. Cain's not going to stop until this is finished." Before Jonah could protest further, she kissed him quick and fierce and desperate, like a woman going to war. Then she walked into Devil's Fork alone. The mine office was larger than it appeared from the outside, having been expanded into the natural cave system behind the original building. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts cathedral and tomb. Virgil Cain sat behind a massive oak desk that looked absurdly out of place in the crude surroundings. He was still the picture of civilized authority, pressed clothes, manicured hands, silver hair perfectly groomed despite the desert heat. But his pale blue eyes held a madness that hadn't been there during the auction, a fevered intensity that spoke of a man who had pushed too far and lost sight of his own limits. To his right stood Silas Grimm, his scarred face split by a cold smile as he watched Mary enter. To his left was a sight that made Mary's blood run cold, Eli's sister, barely 16 years old, tied to a chair with tears streaming down her bruised face. "Mrs. Callahan," Cain said pleasantly, as if welcoming her to a social gathering. "Please have a seat. We have so much to discuss." Mary remained standing, the portfolio clutched in her hands like a shield. "Release the girl first. I'm afraid that's not how negotiations work." Cain replied smoothly. "You have something I want, I have something you want. We trade like civilized people." "Civilized?" Mary's voice cracked like a whip. "You poisoned my daughter. You burned down Jonah's barn. You've terrorized an entire town with your greed. There's nothing civilized about what you've done." Cain's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of genuine anger quickly suppressed. "Mrs. Callahan, I think you misunderstand the situation. You see, this isn't really about money or land claims or silver mines. This is about respect." He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and predatory. "Your husband came to me 7 months ago, desperate for capital to develop his mining claims. I provided that capital in good faith, expecting either repayment or partnership. Instead, Patrick tried to cut me out of the deal entirely. He forged documents, filed false claims, even went so far as to hide the true extent of the silver deposits from me." Mary felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "That's not... The papers show..." The papers show exactly what Patrick wanted them to show. Kane interrupted. Clever forgeries designed to make it look like I was the junior partner in our arrangement. But I have the originals, Mrs. Callahan. The real documents that show Patrick borrowed $3,000 against his family's freedom. He opened a drawer in the desk and pulled out a folder of yellowed papers. Even from across the room, Mary could see Patrick's familiar handwriting, his signature bold and desperate at the bottom of what looked like a debt contract. Your husband was going to disappear. Kane continued conversationally. Take the family and run to California with my money and my silver. I couldn't allow that kind of disrespect to go unpunished. So I had him killed. The words hit Mary like physical blows. You murdered him. I had him thrown from his horse while he was drunk. Hardly required much effort. Patrick was already half dead from guilt and whiskey most nights. I simply accelerated the inevitable. Mary's vision blurred with tears and rage. All this time she'd blamed Patrick for their troubles, for making deals behind her back, for leaving them vulnerable. But he'd been trying to protect them, trying to build something better for his family, and Kane had murdered him for it. The auction was supposed to be the end of it. Kane went on, his voice taking on the rhythm of a man telling a favorite story. I'd buy your family's contracts myself, work you to death in the mines, and everyone would see what happens to people who try to cheat Virgil Kane. But then Jonah Vale had to complicate things. His gaze shifted to something behind Mary, and she turned to see Jonah standing in the entrance to the mine office, his rifle trained on Kane's chest. Hello, Virgil, Jonah said quietly. Been a while. Kane's smile widened, becoming something truly terrible. Jonah Vale, my former business partner. The man who cost me everything 12 years ago. Mary looked between the two men, seeing the weight of old hatred and older betrayals in their faces. What is he talking about? Didn't he tell you? Kane's voice was silk over steel. Mr. Vale and I used to be in business together. Mining ventures, land speculation, enforcement services for people who couldn't pay their debts. We were quite successful until Jonah developed a conscience. Jonah's grip on his rifle tightened, but his voice remained steady. I quit when I realized what kind of man you really were. You quit. Kane snarled, his civilized mask finally slipping, after you stole $50,000 from our partnership and burned down our headquarters. You nearly ruined me, Jonah. It took me 12 years to rebuild what you destroyed. And now I'm going to finish the job, Jonah replied calmly. The tension in the room was electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mary could feel the violence building, could see Silas Grimm's hand hovering over his gun, while Kane's eyes burned with the fever of long-delayed revenge. That's when the explosions began. The first blast brought down part of the mine office's roof, sending chunks of rock and timber crashing around them. The second and third explosions seemed to come from deeper in the mine complex, shaking the entire mountain like an earthquake. What the hell? Grimm started to say, then pitched forward with one of Ironcloud's arrows between his shoulder blades. The Navajo warrior appeared in the doorway like a phantom, his bow already nocked with another arrow. Behind him came Caleb and Emma, both armed and moving with the deadly purpose of people who had been pushed too far. The mines are rigged to collapse. Ironcloud reported calmly. Kane's men tried to trap us in the tunnels. They forgot that my people know these mountains better than they know their own heartbeats. Kane had his gun out now, but he was trapped between Jonah's rifle and Ironcloud's bow with no clear shot at either. His face was white with rage and something that might have been fear. This isn't over, he snarled. I own this territory. I own the law, the sheriff, half the territorial government. You can kill me, but you'll never be safe. Maybe not, Mary said, pulling Patrick's papers from the portfolio. But we'll be rich. She held up the documents for everyone to see. The real mining claims, the production reports, the partnership agreements that showed Kane owed the Callahan estate a fortune in silver revenues. My husband wasn't a fool, Mr. Kane. He kept copies of everything, including records of silver shipments you've been hiding from the territorial tax assessors. Turns out you owe the government almost as much as you owe my family." Kane's face went from white to purple as the implications sank in. Tax evasion was a federal crime, one that could result in prison time, even for a man of his influence. "You want to keep playing this game?" Mary continued. "Fine. But now we're playing by my rules." The mine shook again as another explosion brought down a section of tunnel somewhere in the depths. Dust rained from the ceiling, and Mary realized they needed to get out before the entire complex collapsed. "Caleb, Emma, get the girl," she ordered. "We're leaving." As her children moved to free Eli's sister, Kane made his final play. With the desperate speed of a cornered animal, he lunged for a hidden gun beneath his desk. Jonah's rifle cracked once the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Kane spun and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "That's for Patrick," Jonah said quietly. But Kane wasn't finished. With his good hand, he managed to draw a small pistol from his coat, bringing it up toward Mary with the last of his strength. The arrow took him through the heart. Iron Cloud lowered his bow, his dark eyes sad but resolute. Some men choose the path that leads only to death. We cannot save them from themselves. 6 months later, the Callahan silver mine was the most productive operation in the Arizona Territory, and its success had transformed Dustvale from a dying frontier town into a thriving community. The mine office that had once been Kane's stronghold now served as the headquarters for a partnership between the Callahan family and Iron Cloud's people, sharing both the work and the profits in a way that honored the land and the people who had died for it. Mary stood on the porch of her new house, larger than the old cabin, with real windows and a stone foundation that would last for generations, watching her children play in the yard. Rosie had recovered completely from her poisoning, her laughter once again bright enough to light up the world. Thomas and Samuel were teaching Iron Cloud's nephew how to whittle their heads bent together in concentration. Emma was reading to a group of Navajo children in both English and their native language, preparing them for the school she planned to establish in the spring. And Caleb was learning the mining business with the intensity of a young man who had seen what happened when families lost their financial security. At 18, he already showed the judgment and determination that would make him a worthy inheritor of his father's legacy. Jonah emerged from the mine office, his clothes dusty from a day spent deep in the tunnels, but his eyes bright with satisfaction. The partnership had been good for him too. It gave him purpose beyond his grief and a family to replace the one he'd lost. "How was the yield today?" Mary asked as he climbed the porch steps. "Better than yesterday," he replied, settling into the chair beside hers. "Iron Cloud thinks we've found a new vein that might be even richer than the main one." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the red cliffs of Dustvale Gorge. The view was the same as it had been a year ago, but everything else had changed. The town was prosperous now, with new businesses and families arriving every week. The territorial governor had personally thanked Mary for exposing Kane's tax evasion scheme, and the resulting investigation had cleaned out a network of corruption that stretched from Arizona to Washington. Agnes Poole had disappeared the night Kane died, taking what remained of the Dusty Rose's treasury and leaving behind only debts and bitter memories. Some said she'd gone to San Francisco. Others claimed she'd been seen in Denver. Mary hoped she'd found whatever it was she'd been searching for, but mostly she tried not to think about the saloon keeper at all. Eli Crow had stayed in Dustvale, working at the mine, and slowly rebuilding the trust he'd lost through his betrayal. His sister had recovered from her ordeal and was now employed as Emma's assistant in the new school project. Forgiveness, Mary had learned, was sometimes the hardest work of all, but also the most necessary. "Mary," Jonah said quietly, pulling her attention back to the present. There's something I've been meaning to ask you." She turned to look at him, noting the nervous tension in his shoulders. "What is it He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that caught the light of the setting sun, a ring carved from silver ore and set with a piece of turquoise that looked like a fragment of the Arizona sky. Sarah once told me that love isn't something you find once and lose forever. He said, his voice rough with emotion. She said it's something that grows wherever it's planted if you tend it right. Mary's heart began to pound as she realized what he was asking. I know I'm not Patrick. Jonah continued. I know I can't replace what you had with him. But I love you, Mary Callahan. I love your strength and your stubborn courage and the way you'd walk through fire for your children. I love the family we've built together, and I want to make it official. He held out the ring, his gray eyes hopeful and scared in equal measure. Will you marry me? Mary looked at the ring, then at her children playing in the yard, then at the man who had saved them all in more ways than one. A year ago, she had been a widow facing slavery or death, with no hope and no future. Now she had wealth security, a thriving business, and the chance for love again. Yes, she said simply, and watched Jonah's face light up like the sunrise. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a shadow passed overhead. Mary looked up to see a red-tailed hawk circling above their home, its wings catching the last light of day as it rode the desert wind toward the mountains. For just a moment she thought she heard Patrick's voice in the whisper of the wind. Take care of them, Jonah. Take care of my family. And she knew that he would. 1 year later, the wedding was held at sunset on the first anniversary of Virgil Cain's death, with the entire population of Dustvale in attendance. Father Miguel had ridden up from Tucson to perform the ceremony, and Iron Cloud had blessed the union according to Navajo custom. The children had insisted on helping with every detail, from Rosie's enthusiastic flower scattering to Caleb's dignified escort of his mother down the makeshift aisle. As Mary and Jonah exchanged vows beneath an arch of desert wildflowers, the assembled crowd included faces that spoke to how much the community had changed. Former enemies sat beside new friends, while children who had known only fear and hardship now played together without regard for the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. Dr. Morrison had returned to Dustvale and established a proper medical practice, working alongside Mary to provide health care for the growing population. Sheriff Daniels had been replaced by a younger man whose integrity matched his courage, and the territorial government had stationed a permanent marshal in town to ensure that Cain's kind of corruption could never take root again. The Callahan Vale silver mine continued to prosper, but more importantly, its success had attracted other honest businesses to the area. There was talk of a railroad spur that would connect Dustvale to the main line, bringing even more growth and opportunity to the region. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Mary found herself standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching her new husband dance with Rosie while the fiddle music echoed off the canyon walls. The little girl's laughter carried clearly across the gathering, and Mary realized that this moment of pure joy was what Patrick had been fighting for when he made his desperate deal with Cain. Iron Cloud appeared beside her, moving with the silent grace that had made him such an effective warrior. In the years since Cain's death, the Navajo leader had become one of Mary's closest friends and most trusted advisors. You are thinking of your first husband, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I am, Mary admitted, wondering if he would approve of what we've built here. Iron Cloud was silent for a moment, his dark eyes taking in the scene before them. Children playing without fear, families sharing food and stories, former enemies working together toward a common future. A man's true worth is measured not by what he achieves in life, he said finally, but by what grows from the seeds he plants. Look around you, Mary Vale. Your Patrick's seeds have grown into something beautiful. As if summoned by their conversation, Eli Crow approached hesitantly. The young man had worked hard to rebuild his reputation in the community, and his relationship with Emma had grown into something tentative but genuine. Tonight, however, he seemed nervous about something more than romance. "Mrs. Vale," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you again for giving me a second chance. I know what I did was unforgivable." "Everyone deserves a chance to make amends," Mary replied gently. "You've more than proven yourself this past year." Eli nodded gratefully, then seemed to gather his courage for something. "There's something else, ma'am. Something I've been meaning to tell you about the night Mr. Kane died." Mary felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "What about it?" "Before the shooting started, Kane said something to me. About Agnes Poole. He said she was the one who really ran things, that she was the brains behind everything, and he was just the front man. Said if anything happened to him, she'd make sure everyone paid." The revelation hit Mary like a physical blow. Agnes Poole, the woman they'd all dismissed as Kane's minor partner, had been the true architect of the reign of terror that had gripped Dust Vale. "Eli," Mary said carefully, "why are you telling me this now?" The young man's face was pale in the lamplight. "Because I saw her today. Agnes, she's back in town." Before Mary could respond, a new voice cut through the music and laughter of the celebration, cold-cultured and unmistakably familiar. "Well, Mary Callahan, or should I say Mrs. Vale now?" The crowd parted to reveal Agnes Poole, standing at the edge of the celebration, dressed in expensive clothes that spoke of prosperity gained elsewhere. But her green eyes held the same cold calculation they'd always carried. And the smile on her lips was sharp enough to cut glass. "Agnes," Mary said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady, "you're not welcome here." "Oh, but I think I am," Agnes replied smoothly. "You see, I've spent this past year in very interesting places, San Francisco, Denver, even Washington, meeting very interesting people. People with influence. People who are very concerned about the irregularities in how certain mining claims were transferred after poor Virgil's unfortunate death." The celebration had stopped completely now, with every eye focused on the confrontation. Jonah moved to stand beside Mary, his hand resting on his gun, while Ironcloud melted back into the shadows with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. "What do you want, Agnes?" Mary asked. Agnes's smile widened. "Justice, my dear. You see, Virgil Kane was legally appointed as the territorial administrator for disputed mining claims. His authority to auction your family's contracts was completely legitimate, which means your husband's documents, the ones you used to claim ownership of the mines, were obtained through fraud." Mary felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. "That's impossible. Patrick filed those claims legally. Patrick filed claims on land that was already under federal investigation for territorial violations," Agnes corrected. "Claims that were legally void from the moment he signed them. I have the documentation to prove it." She reached into her reticule and pulled out an official-looking folder, sealed with territorial government wax. New ownership papers properly filed and legally binding. "As of tomorrow morning, the Callahan Vale silver mine reverts to its rightful owner." "Which would be?" Jonah asked quietly. Agnes's smile became truly terrifying. "Me, of course. I've purchased the rights from the territorial government for the price of back taxes owed. Quite a bargain, really." The implications crashed over Mary like a collapsing mine shaft. Everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, could be taken away. By legal maneuvering, they were powerless to stop. "However," Agnes continued conversationally, "I'm not an unreasonable woman. I'm prepared to offer you a partnership. 60% of the mine's profits in exchange for your family's cooperation." "What kind of cooperation?" Mary asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The kind that ensures I never have to worry about competition or interference again. The kind that makes it clear to everyone in this territory who really holds the power." The threat was unmistakable. Agnes wanted complete control, not just of the mine, but of the entire community. She wanted to finish what Cain had started, creating a kingdom of fear and exploitation with herself as its unchallenged ruler. Mary looked around at the faces surrounding her, her children, her new husband, the friends and neighbors who had become her chosen family. A year ago, she had been powerless to protect them. But that woman was gone, burned away in the fires of trial, and forged into something stronger. "No," she said simply. Agnes blinked clearly, having expected a different response. "I beg your pardon. I said no. We don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't partner with murderers, and we sure as hell don't bow down to anyone who thinks they can walk into our home and threaten our family." Mary stepped forward, and Agnes actually took a step back. "You want to fight, Agnes, fine. But this time, you're not facing a desperate widow with no options. This time you're facing a community that knows how to stand together." As if responding to her words, the crowd began to move. Jonah stepped up beside her, his rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. Iron Cloud emerged from the shadows, with his bow ready. Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Peterson, even young Eli Crow, all of them took their places beside Mary, with the quiet determination of people who had found something worth defending. Agnes looked around at the gathering faces, and her confident smile began to waver. "You're making a mistake, Mary. I have the law on my side." "Maybe," Mary replied. "But we have something better. We have each other." For a moment the desert silence was complete, except for the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Then Agnes straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirts, her composure returning like armor being strapped back into place. Very well," she said coolly. "If that's how you want to play this game, so be it. But remember, Mary, I've had a year to prepare for this moment. You have no idea what's coming." She turned and walked back into the darkness, her heels clicking against the stone like the sound of a ticking clock counting down to disaster. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Mary found herself alone with Jonah and Iron Cloud. The celebration was over, but the real battle was just beginning. "How much time do you think we have?" Jonah asked quietly. Iron Cloud studied the darkness where Agnes had disappeared, his expression thoughtful. "She will not act immediately. This is a woman who plans carefully, who strikes only when she is certain of victory. But she will strike." Mary nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. This time, it felt like purpose. "Then we better get ready," she said simply. As they walked back toward their home, a coyote called from somewhere in the hills, a wild, lonely sound that spoke of ancient freedoms and untamed spirits. Mary listened to its voice, echoing off the canyon walls, and realized that some things could never be conquered, never be owned, never be broken. Agnes Poole was about to learn that lesson the hard way.